Hi everyone, this is lecture 1 for Lab A. I'm going to cover a couple things related to your Lab A, giving you some background on physical education and teaching PE. I'm going to be covering the 3 dimensions of teaching, which you can find in your EDU 255 packet on page A1. I'm going to talk about the new era of physical education and give you some of the history of PE, where we've been and where we're going. This is on B1 in your EDU 255 packet. I'll talk a little bit about professionalism. Then we'll get into the standards, both the New York State and the national standards. And I'll end with talking about the proposed regents for physical education in New York State. So the 3 dimensions of teaching. Something you need to understand about teaching is that it's dynamic, meaning it's always changing. You never know what your students are going to do. You never know what's going to happen in class. You kind of have to understand that it's not going to be one thing works in every situation. So it's dynamic. It's always changing. This makes it inexact. You don't know, again, you don't know what your students are going to do, what situation is going to arise that you have to deal with. This makes teaching very complicated. It also makes it difficult to discuss, difficult to analyze, and pretty hard to find agreement about what the idea of a good teacher is. So what makes a good teacher? We've decided in 255 to talk about teaching in 3 dimensions. So if we unpack teaching, we can think about it from 3 different dimensions. We can talk about the content. And this has to do with the knowledge of the content to be taught. So in physical education, this means, do I know the cues for throwing? Do I know what the rules are for basketball? All of the content that you need to know about the stuff that you're teaching. So think about your activity classes. You're learning a lot of content in those activity classes. You work on your skills, which helps you know that content, which helps you have that knowledge. The next dimension is the mechanics. So this is how the teacher constructs the lesson from a pedagogical point of view. So pedagogical, what does that mean? That is basically the study of teaching. The scientific part of teaching. It includes how to write a lesson plan. There's a specific way that we're going to have you write a lesson plan, and you're going to learn about it this semester. How do you write objectives? Same thing. There's a specific way to write objectives, which are the goals of your lesson or your unit or your whole entire year. So those mechanics, how to give feedback. We can teach you these specific things that will help you to become a good teacher. The third dimension is the affect. So these are the affective elements or your behaviors that the teacher brings to the lesson. So your personality, your enthusiasm. Without this affect, most teaching would be kind of boring. So do you look like you want to be teaching what you're teaching? That's part of your enthusiasm, your personality. Are you the teacher that usually shares the jokes to get your students interested in the lesson? Are you the very strict teacher that expects these behaviors, and that motivates your students? There's all different types of affect, and that's just your personal affect. During this class, you're going to focus mostly on mechanics. There's going to be a lot that you learn about how to write objectives, which you'll do during this lab, how to write a lesson plan, what types of feedback should you give, when are you going to give that feedback, how do you set your students up in the gym so that you can manage your class, where should the teacher stand? So there's all of these mechanical things that you're going to be learning during 255. You're also going to be working on your affect. Many beginning teachers struggle with having a good affect. You have nerves, you're up in front of a class, and that affects your affect. You also just haven't had the experience to try out different things in your class. We're not going to focus on content. I'm not going to be teaching you any content. You will have to go research different topics so that you can teach and practice the mechanics and the affect, but I'm not going to teach you any content. We use these 3 dimensions of teaching because it helps us to analyze teaching expertise. Each dimension requires different types of knowledge. The content, you need to know the content of PE. Like I said before, what are the cues for kicking? What are the rules of basketball? The mechanical dimension, you have to learn and practice the different mechanics. And then the affect, you just need experience with the teaching. Each dimension requires different kinds of preparation in order to be proficient. Proficiency in all three can be individually artistic. So how you weave these three things together can help you to become a good and effective PE teacher. Expert teachers are usually proficient in all three domains. Novice teachers need to understand that proficiency, it comes. Each domain requires a different kind of analysis scheme or feedback. So we'll look at the three dimensions separately so you can get better feedback. And also, you need to understand that expertise in all three domains takes time and vigilance. You need to work at it, and that's what we're going to be doing during this class. The next thing I'm going to discuss is the new era of physical education. So I want you to understand where PE has been and where it's going to. If you take a look at page B1, this is going to share the information that I'll be talking about in the next couple minutes. So explaining the new era of physical education in New York State. We want higher standards and increased accountability. Going back to the 1980s, there was a national concern about education. Were our schools producing good members of society? People started looking at schools and asking this question. They decided no, they needed to make a change. So they decided that PE really wasn't important and they needed to focus more on other things so that students would graduate and become good members of society. During this time, there were 2 attacks on the time mandates for PE, which didn't go through. As you know, there's still time mandates for PE. In the early 1990s, education started moving towards standards-based education. So there were no standards before this time. They said this is what you should teach in math, this is what you should teach in English, but there were no specific standards, meaning you have to know this by this grade to be able to move on to the next grade. You have to know this by the time you graduate to be a good member of society. So in the 1990s, education, all different core subjects started developing standards for their subject. Using these standards, you had to start thinking about planning in terms of backwards planning. So the standard was the end goal. By the time you graduate in 12th grade, you need to know A, B, C. You need to be able to do 1, 2, 3. And all, like I said, all core subjects would do this. So you start with the end goal in mind and you plan backwards. We're going to learn more about that later in the semester. New York State Regents created goals for all academic areas except for PE. PE wasn't included. And when the PE leaders said, hey, why were we left out? What's going on here? They said, well, what's your social purpose? We need to include these academic areas where they're going to contribute to having good people in our society. And PE is not important. They don't need to be physically active. People don't need to know how to throw a ball and kick a ball and do a push-up. So physical education leaders had to define what the social purpose of PE is and was. And they did that. So then in 1996, the New York State standards for physical education were introduced. So up until 1996, there were no standards for physical education. It was basically people were taught this is good content for physical education, but there were no specific standards. In the late 1990s, New York State AFERT actually recommended a Regents level goal for physical education, and they were based on these standards. So New York State AFERT actually had tried to get a Regents examination approved for physical education, meaning for your Regents diploma, you had to pass this physical education Regents. It was never approved, but the Regents level goals are still great goals for someone teaching physical education in New York State. So right now, standards were introduced in 1996. We're still in a period of transition. If you go back to 1996 and you look at the people who were teaching then, and then you look at the people who are teaching now, there's some people who are teaching now who were educated. They were taught how to be a PE teacher before 1996. So they weren't taught these standards as they were preparing to become a PE teacher. Some school districts are teaching based on the New Era goals and these standards, but many still lag behind. They're still working on implementing the standards into their PE program. We're in the era of increased standards and increased accountability. And things are getting better. When I started doing this teaching here 12, 13 years ago, I would talk to students about what their PE program was like. And it was pretty bad. There weren't, it was roll out the ball, just go to PE, entertain them for a little bit, and then great, we're done. But PE, what I'm hearing from you all as you're coming into my class is PE is getting better. So this is promising. Again, still in the period of transition. Some school districts are teaching based on these standards and new era goals, but there's still a lot that are adjusting. As you all learn these standards and learn new PE, you're going to become the new physical educators, the new professionals, and you can help with this transition. And you will help with this transition. The next thing we're going to talk about is professionalism. I'm going to give you a specific definition of professionalism that I would like you to know. I'm going to share why professionalism is so important to being a physical educator. Let's go back to the 1980s when there were the time attacks on PE. Why do you think PE was attacked? Yes, because no one valued PE. They said, well, PE is not really important. We want to create good people for our society. They don't need PE to do that. But that's not true. And we had to prove that no, PE is important and we need to be here. How did society view PE as a school subject? Again, like I said before, it was come, moved around a little bit. We'll keep you busy while your teachers are doing other things. It's just for fun. You're not really learning anything. That's what society thought about physical education. And even now, how does society view PE now? How is it portrayed in the media? Think to movies you watch or TV shows that you watch. The PE teacher is usually portrayed in a specific way, and it's usually not a very good way. So we need to change that. So that's why professionalism is so important. What I'd like you to do right now is take 3 minutes and jot down a definition of professionalism. Don't look it up. Just write down, what do you think professionalism is? What does it mean to be a professional? So go ahead, pause the video, take a couple minutes, jot down your answer, what is professionalism, and then restart the video. All right, so by this point, you should have a definition of professionalism, what you think professionalism means. Before I tell you what the actual definition of professionalism is, I just want to say one more time, it's really important for you as a future PE professional and all PE teachers to act professional so that our profession is taken seriously. I know when I told family and friends that I was going to be going to school to be a PE teacher, they were all kind of surprised. They said, oh, why would you do that? I thought you were smart. This isn't something you should do. You're just going to be a PE teacher and wear sweats all the time. People don't take PE seriously, and we need to show that we are an important core academic subject that should be taken seriously in schools and in society. So now we get to the definition of professionalism. So what does professionalism mean? And this is a general definition. The definition is all those behaviors that uphold the integrity of the profession. All those behaviors that uphold the integrity of the profession. This is the definition that I want you to memorize, know, be able to spit back at me when I say, hey, what's professionalism? What I've listed down here are some things, some behaviors that do uphold the integrity of our profession. When you think about different professions, these behaviors might be different. The dress is different for different professions. Integrity might be different for different professions. So for physical education, these are some of the things that we need to do as physical educators to be professional. So we need to be prepared. Always be prepared for your class. Don't go in and wing it. A lot of old school PE do that. They say, hey, what are we going to teach today? As they're walking through the door, I'll go get some basketballs. But professional plans ahead, has goals, follows the standards, and is prepared for their lessons. On time, always be on time. That kind of shows that you are invested, interested, and shows that you're a professional. Being dressed professionally. So as you can see, I have my polo my Cortland polo. You don't have to wear the Cortland polo, but a polo is professional for a physical educator. Khakis, you should look neat. Sneakers, you should wear clothes that are easy to move around in, and just look put together. You don't want to wear t-shirts. A lot of you probably saw this when you were in school taking physical education. T-shirts were acceptable, but we want to up the professionalism. So Cortland, you wear a polo. Flexible. This is part of being a professional, being flexible and not being stuck in your ways. New situations are going to come at you. Being knowledgeable about what you're teaching, being approachable, being adaptable. There's many other behaviors. These are just some of the ones that I highlighted during this lecture. Again, know this definition. I'm going to say it one more time. All those behaviors that uphold the integrity of the profession. All right, we're going to take a look at New York State and national standards. So like I said before, New York State standards were developed and introduced in 1996. This is an exciting semester because for the first time since 1996, the New York State standards have been updated, and they're much more in line with the national standards, which is going to make it easier. We used to teach New York State standards, which were broken into 3 different standards, and they had different kind of subcategories. And national had 5 standards, so it was a little confusing going back and forth. Now, introduced in 2020, there are new New York State standards. There's 6 New York State standards now, but again, much more aligned with national standards. The national standards were last updated in 2013, so those are pretty well implemented into our program and different PE programs around the country. I'm going to go over the New York State standards. We're going to take a look at them at a glance. And then we're going to take a look at the implementation just so you understand as a physical education professional how they're being implemented in higher education and then in other schools. And then after that, we'll take a look at the national standards. This is the document of the New York State standards. It is quite long. As you can see, it's 53 pages, and it goes through all the different standards. If we take a look, the New York State Learning Standards 2020, we'll get there. This is kindergarten, introduction to kindergarten. So here's standard 1, demonstrates competency in a variety of motor skills. Standard 2, knowledge, principles, strategies, and tactics related to movement and performance. And when we take a look at national, you're going to see how similar New York State and national now are, even in language. 3, demonstrates knowledge and skills to achieve and maintain a health-enhancing level of physical activity and fitness. 4 is exhibits responsible personal and social behavior. 5, recognizes the value of physical education, physical activity. And then 6, recognizes career opportunities. If we back up a little bit and we take a look at the different standards, you're going to start to see the domains. Remember the psychomotor, cognitive, and affective domain that I talked about previously. Demonstrates competency in a variety of motor skills and movement patterns. This is very obviously connected to the psychomotor domain. Standard 2 applies knowledge, cognitive domain. Standard 3 has to do with fitness. Now this is going to include psychomotor and cognitive. Demonstrates the knowledge and skills. Knowledge and skills, cognitive and psychomotor, excuse me. Standard 4 and 5 have to do with affect, so your affective domain, exhibits responsible personal and social behavior, recognizes the value of physical activity. And then our 6th standard, New York State, this is the one that New York State has that national does not have, recognizes career opportunities in the field, in physical activity and fitness. And in New York State, we wanted our students to graduate knowing that, hey, there's careers that you can go into. If you really enjoyed physical education, you enjoy movement, there's careers that you can go into. So we included that as part of our PE curriculum and created a standard for it. The next document is the New York State Physical Education Learning Standards at a glance. This is them in a different format, and it helps you see what is included in each standard. So you can see the standards are the same, just the format of the different components or elements are different. So you see standard 1 there. It shows the different activity categories, and then it lists the grades and what are the outcomes for each of the different grades. Goes to standard 2, and it goes all the way to standard 6. Okay? And now when we talk about implementation of the learning standards, this takes time. You don't just automatically say there's new standards and everyone's going to be using them. So right now we're in phase 1. There's going to be training on the new standards, awareness of the rollout time, statewide collaboration with BOCES, school districts, professional organizations, and higher education. So we've decided at Cortland to start teaching you these standards because once you graduate, it's what you're going to be using. Phase 2 is going to be starting in a year. So then it's going to be guidance for local programs on how to implement these new standards and adjust the curriculum that they have to align with these new standards. And then in fall of 2023 is when the first full year of new standards are implemented into the classroom. Doesn't mean that you cannot implement these standards before fall of 2023. You're going to be learning them now. It's possible you could be teaching, have a teaching job before fall of 2023. So it doesn't mean you cannot use them before this time. This is just the goal for when those standards are going to be implemented and all districts are using them statewide. Okay, let's take a look at the national standards now. As you can see, there's 5 national standards. You can see them right here. And they are very similar, or I should say the New York State ones are very similar to the national standards in language also. So competency in a variety of motor skills and movement patterns, knowledge, principles, and strategies related to movement and performance, knowledge and skills to achieve and maintain a health-enhancing level of physical activity and fitness. So 1 through 5, very similar. New York State just has the additional 6. We're going to get into the outcomes, the national outcomes that are related to these standards at a time later in this semester. If you move on to the next slide, you're going to see that New York State Regents level recommendation that I mentioned previously. So shorthand, this recommendation is 6 plus 3 over 3 plus a personal fitness plan. So what this means is when you graduate, you should be competent in 6 activities, and these activities are your choice. Students had some choice. You should be proficient in 3 activities, and these 9 activities, so 6 plus 3 is 9, should be spread out over 3 different activity categories. You can't have all of your 9 skills be in outdoor education. You should have some in team sports, some in target sports, some in outdoor education, some in dance and aesthetics. There's a sheet in your packet that explains what the New York State categories are. What does competent and proficient mean? If you think about the GLSP, it's a rubric that you use for assessing. You should have done this in 321, your movement education class. There's a 4-point scale. Okay, a 3 out of 4 is someone who is competent with the skill or activity, and a 4 out of 4 is someone who is proficient in the skill or activity. So you can see overall, competent is you're pretty good. You can use this in a physical activity setting. You may not be the best, but you're pretty competent with this skill and activity. Proficient is you're good. You go out into this physical activity world, you're going to be one of the better people who are performing the skills and participating in the activity. The other component, so if you see up here, that's the 6 plus 3 over 3, all students need to develop a personal fitness plan. So this means knowing about the components of health-related fitness and skill-related fitness and coming up with a plan to work on those different components. So again, 6 plus 3, competent in 6 activities, proficient in 3 activities, over 3 different activity categories. They wanted you to have some variety, some depth in the different types of activities you are competent and proficient in, and you must be able to write a personal fitness plan. So why was this not implemented? Okay, this seems like a great thing. Why was it not implemented? They tried to develop, and when I say they, I mean PE leaders in the state. They tried to develop an assessment for this, but found it was very, very difficult. New York State is huge, and there's so many different people using this different assessment. It wasn't reliable and it wasn't valid in assessing someone from Buffalo who was being taught in this region this way by these teacher versus someone in Long Island. There wasn't any agreement between how you were going to assess those two people. And they said, well, it's not going to be fair. It's not fair that someone in Buffalo is being assessed by this teacher and someone in Long Island is being assessed by this teacher. And there's no way we're going to get complete agreement between all of these different PE teachers. So it was never implemented. But again, it's still a really good goal to use as a PE teacher. If your students graduate and they have these skills, competent in 6 activities, proficient in 3 over different activity categories, and they're able to write a personal fitness plan, it is very likely that they're going to be able to be active and healthy for the rest of their life, and which is the goal. We want our students to graduate and be able to be healthy and active for the rest of their life. All right, so I know I threw a lot of information at you. This is kind of the foundation, the building blocks as we move forward and start learning about what you're going to be doing for your Lab A teaching. So review. We talked about the 3 dimensions of teaching. And we look at teaching this way so we can help break it down, analyze it, and give feedback in these 3 different dimensions. Talked about the new era of PE in New York State, that old PE versus new PE, and we're in that transition period trying to move from the old PE where we weren't taken as seriously as some of the other subjects into this new era of PE where we are a valuable subject in the schools. Talked about professionalism and why it was so important. Be sure you know that definition, all those behaviors that uphold the integrity of the profession. Then I showed you some standards, both New York State and national, and you're luckier than other semesters because they're pretty similar now. It's not going to be hard to go back and forth between New York State and national. And then I talked about the regions in PE. Now that you've listened to this lecture, go ahead and take the Check for Understanding quiz that is right underneath this in Blackboard that highlights some of the more important things in this lecture. If you have any questions or comments, please email, and good luck on your quiz.